John Locke, The Slave to Reason, by Jacob Wegner, Introduction to Philosophy, Spring 2004. Group 1, What is Philosophy? Taken from Philosophy, The Quest for Truth, by Louis P. Pogman. It was once said of the English philosopher John Locke that he was always, in the greatest and in the smallest affairs of human life, disposed to follow reason, whosoever suggested it, he being ever a faithful servant, even a slave to truth, never abandoning anything else, and following her for her own sake purely. Throughout his life in the 17th century, Locke was known as a man that loved to search for the truth, which he believed came from God. Locke's faith was quite important to him. He spent several years studying at Christ Church of Oxford University. He served for a time as physician and administrative assistant to the Earl of Shaftesbury. At one point, the Earl's attempted treason against the monarchy forced Locke to live in the Netherlands. During that time, he became friendly with England's next king and queen. Up until his death in 1704, Locke was committed to writing about educational reform, religious tolerance, and the freedom of the press. Locke's faith certainly fueled his philosophical ideas. He viewed philosophy as a search for truth, and believed that truth ultimately came from God, the creator of all things good. Furthermore, he believed that truth and belief in God were rooted in reason, and that reason and faith were crucial to one another. He believed that claims of faith had to be supported by sufficient evidence. One of the best-known works of Locke is two treatises on government. Thomas Jefferson is widely believed to have drawn much of his inspiration for the Declaration of Independence from this title. This work and Locke's essay concerning human understanding influenced many of America's founding fathers, and had a lasting impact on Western philosophy as a whole. Locke's Of Enthusiasm and the Quest for Truth is one of the most famous selections from Human Understanding. In it he looks at why we are caught up in seeking the truth, the roles of reason and revelation, the flaws of enthusiasm, and how he feels God has chosen to support revelations to man through the use of reason. Locke believes that those that search for truth do so out of the love of the truth. This is especially true for academics pursuing their favorite subject in study, or any rational being looking to find truth. Those that seek truth won't settle for propositions based upon weak proofs, or those that lack sufficient evidence. They, in turn, are antagonized by a group that believes they have authority in deciding what is true, and wish to impose their beliefs on others. These people don't rely on the combination of faith and reason, but instead on enthusiasm. Locke communicates to us that enthusiasm depends largely on revelation. Reason is not a part of the picture here. He states that it assumes the ungrounded fancies of man's own brain can be declared as foundation of both opinion and conduct. Locke held that reason was natural revelation, given to us by God. God-given revelation was simply another form of reason, backed up by both testimony and proofs. If God, who Locke believed to be the Father of lights, was good and true, he would never present something to us that would mislead us or seek to confuse us. He believed that many of the enthusiasts of his day, by disregarding reason, were disregarding revelation as well. Instead of looking to support and validate the revelations, they justified them solely on their own emotions and opinions. Locke believed that enthusiasts sought to have these self-claimed pretend revelations out of selfishness or laziness. Instead of looking for applying God-given reason to support their divine revelations, they sought to justify their conclusions because they are convinced of the authenticity of those revelations. In effect, they made their own thoughts above all others. Enthusiasts feel sure because they are right, and are right because they are sure. This is quite an unsound proposition. There is no reason or support involved. They themselves solely justify their beliefs or principles. Locke wanted to make a distinction between man's inclination towards an idea or action versus God's spirit moving the man into action. He believed that revelation wasn't necessarily a proportion of a truth is already known, and it could be supported by reason. There are only two ways we can approach and attempt to validate revelation: by evidence based upon what one has seen, or by evidence taken from the testimony of another. Enthusiasts are largely basing their claims off of their own stirrings. Locke states that they believe something to be a revelation because they firmly believe it, and they believe it because it is a revelation. Their justification is very self-reliant. Saul of Tarsus, the man later that would become St. Paul, was suckered into enthusiasm through his persecution of the early Christian church. He believed he was following God's revelation by killing all of these Christians. A supernatural encounter with God made him re-examine the Jewish scriptures and weigh the scriptures, his encounter, and the claims of Christ against one another. Though he was once caught up in his own revelation, after he put God's revelation and the truth of the scriptures together, he came to a sound conclusion. Locke wrote that light, true light, in the mind is, or can be nothing else but the evidence of the truth of any proposition. If a proposition is not self-evident, the proofs must be valid to back it up. Locke also uses the prophets of the Old Testament to solidify his claim that reason and faith must be used in tandem. When God revealed things to these prophets supernaturally, he didn't make them set aside the natural revelations. Reason was used to help evaluate the validity of these revelations and to properly determine their source. Moses, for example, saw a burning bush and heard the voice of God, instructing him to go back to Egypt and free the Hebrews from slavery. This was separate from any impulse Moses had to do so. The burning bush and audible voice of God were tangible. God further helped to assure and direct Moses through the miracle of turning his staff into a serpent. Take Gideon, another of the Bible's great heroes, who was commissioned by an angel to free his people from their oppressors. He sought a sign from God, in the form of a dew-drenched fleece, to help solidify and validate God's calling. Locke doesn't totally rule out enlightenment coming solely from God, without external, tangible evidence. He believed that such claims of enlightenment should be weighed against both reason and Scripture. Revelation of truth could then be determined to be accurate. Locke's view of philosophy as a search for the truth for truth's sake, and seeking the enlightenment when dealing with worldly matters, contrasted that of the Buddha. The Buddha believed that philosophy and enlightenment were a mechanism from which humans could escape from the suffering of life, and reach nirvana, a state of complete happiness and peace. People needed to free themselves of all desires and worldly things. Locke's focus, however, and his devotion to Christian faith, led him to believe that a good life was full of pleasure, and that by following God's divine law, which was discovered by reason, we could spare ourselves much pain. Locke's idea, to which many Americans and Western philosophers ascribe to, is that people by nature had certain rights and duties, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When a governing body violated this social contract with its people, the wrongs must be righted. The Buddha, on the other hand, discouraged political involvement, and sought to overcome his suffering and show others to do so as well. Locke, believing that Jesus Christ, not the Buddhist Dharma, was the way to overcome our suffering, and that Holy Scripture was God's revealed truth, would probably not ascribe to Buddhism. Logic through abductive reasoning. Abductive reasoning was made popular by the 19th century American philosopher Charles S. Peirce. Unlike inductive or deductive reasoning, abductive reasoning sets out to best explain the facts. It may, for example, propose that the best explanation for puddles forming outside is a recent rainfall, or the hair clippings on the floor of a saloon are a result of someone receiving a haircut. It cannot be proven absolutely true or absolutely false. Abductive reasoning has been described as educated guesswork or intuition. We use abductive reasoning to help us answer some big philosophical questions, such as why one believes in God, or why one believes in evolution. In order to answer these questions, we are using abductive reasoning. Our resulting beliefs are the best explanations to these questions based on our current knowledge. To effectively use abductive reasoning, you must break down an author's argument into several parts. First, identify any major thesis or conclusion ideas. Then, identify the premise that supports those ideas. Next, outline the premise and conclusions and analyze them to see how well the premises support the conclusions. Look for weak or unsound statements within the arguments, and think of any carnal examples to their claim. After you've worked through this process, you can better determine if the reasoning best explains fact. Let us take a look at an argument from Thomas Aquinas and apply abductive reasoning to it. The first point states that some things are in motion. This can be identified as a premise. The second point is that nothing in the world can move itself, but must be moved by another. This is our second premise. The third point states that there cannot be an infinite regressive motions. This is indeed another premise. All three of these leading to point 4, our first conclusion. This conclusion states that there must be a mover who is responsible for all other motion. The conclusion is used in arguing the final conclusion. The next premise, that the first mover is what we call God, would also have to further define what God is. This final premise, with our first conclusion, leads to the final conclusion, that therefore God exists. This example of abductive reasoning leads us to believe that the best explanation, based on the premises, is of the existence of God.